The Knitting Fox. Part 1. The Cozy Hollow. Deep in the middle of a quiet meadow, surrounded by tall trees and soft grass, there was a hollow at the base of an old oak tree. This wasn't just any hollow. It was the home of Winifred, the knitting fox. Winifred's hollow was the coziest place you could imagine. Inside, there were shelves lined with balls of colorful yarn. Some were soft and fluffy, like clouds, while others shimmered as though they had captured the morning dew. There was a fireplace in the corner, its golden flames flickering gently. Next to it sat Winifred's favorite armchair, worn in just the right spots to make it perfect for curling up and knitting. A little table beside the chair held her teacup, a plate of honey biscuits, and her notebook, where she scribbled ideas for new knitting patterns. The hollow smelled like cinnamon and fresh wool, with just a hint of lavender from the sachets she tucked into her yarn baskets. Winifred loved her little home, and she especially loved knitting. Every day, she picked out a different yarn and started a new project. Sometimes it was a scarf as soft as a rabbit's tail, and other times it was a blanket big enough to wrap around a family of hedgehogs. She didn't knit for herself. No, Winifred's joy came from making things for her friends in the meadow. Whether it was a hat to keep a squirrel's ears warm, or a pair of mittens for a mole digging in the frosty ground, Winifred always found the perfect project to help someone. One crisp afternoon, as the leaves outside turned red and gold, Winifred sat by her window knitting a scarf. The yarn was a bright orange, just like the pumpkins that dotted the meadow at this time of year. She smiled as her needles clicked together, making soft stitches. "It's going to be a chilly winter," she said to herself, glancing at the sky. The clouds were gray, and a cool breeze shook the leaves on the trees. Everyone will need something warm. Winifred thought about her friends in the meadow. She had just finished a pair of tiny socks for the sparrows, and was planning to start on a shawl for the owl who flew through the night. There was always someone who could use something cozy, and Winifred liked to stay busy. As she worked, she hummed a quiet tune. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves mixed with the soft crackle of the fire, creating a melody that made the hollow feel even warmer. Winifred paused her knitting to look at her shelves. "I'll need more yarn soon," she said, noticing that some of her favorite colors were running low. The forest green, perfect for hats and scarves, was almost gone, and the soft white she used for blankets was down to the last ball. "I'll visit the meadow tomorrow," she decided. The woolly sheep by the river always have extra to spare. She folded the orange scarf neatly and placed it in her finished basket, which was already full of colorful creations waiting to be delivered. Winifred stretched her paws and poured herself a fresh cup of tea, feeling satisfied with her day's work. Outside, the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the meadow in soft shades of pink and gold. Winifred pulled a blanket over her lap and gazed out the window. It was peaceful moments like these that made her hollow feel like the coziest place in the world. Part 2. A chilly visit. The next day, the sky was a pale gray, and the wind had turned colder. The leaves on the trees rustled loudly, and a few fluttered to the ground, creating little piles of orange and yellow. Winifred wrapped a scarf around her neck and peeked out of her hollow. "It's certainly getting nippy," she said to herself, watching her breath puff into the air like tiny clouds. She tugged her coat tighter and was about to head off toward the river to visit the woolly sheep when she heard a knock at her door. Tap, tap, tap. Winifred tilted her head. Visitors were rare this early in the day, and most of her friends were busy preparing for the colder months. She trotted to the door and opened it to find Milo the rabbit standing there. His long ears were trembling, and his little paws were tucked into his coat. "Winifred," Milo said, his voice shaky, "the wind tore all the moss off my burrow and I can't seem to keep warm. Even my scarf doesn't help." Winifred looked at him closely. His scarf was thin and frayed, barely enough to block the chill. "Oh, Milo, you poor dear," she said, gently ushering him inside. Come in, you'll catch a cold standing out there." Milo hopped inside and sighed with relief as the warmth of the fire surrounded him. He sat on a cushion near the hearth, his whiskers twitching as he rubbed his paws together. "I'll make you something much warmer," Winifred said, her voice kind but determined. "A proper scarf that'll keep you cozy all winter." Winifred rummaged through her shelves, searching for the perfect yarn. Her paws landed on the last ball of forest green, soft and thick, like moss on a summer morning. "Ah, this will do nicely," she said, setting it beside her favorite needles. Milo watched as Winifred began to knit. The needles clicked rhythmically, moving faster than he thought possible. "You're amazing, Winifred," he said, his nose twitching. "I don't know how you do it." Winifred chuckled. "It's just practice, dear, and a little love in every stitch." As she worked, she and Milo talked about the changes in the meadow. Milo told her about the squirrels gathering acorns, the hedgehogs building their nests, and the birds fluffing their feathers to prepare for the cold. The cozy chatter made the hollow feel even warmer, and soon the forest green scarf began to take shape. After about an hour, Winifred held up the finished scarf. It was thick and long, with neat rows of stitches and tassels at the ends. She wrapped it gently around Milo's neck, adjusting it so it covered his ears. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her work. "Now you're ready for the cold." Milo's eyes widened as he felt the softness of the scarf. "Oh, Winifred, it's perfect," he said, hopping up and down with excitement. "I've never had anything so warm. Thank you, thank you." Winifred smiled. "Stay warm, Milo, and let me know if you need anything else." Milo hopped out of the hollow, his scarf trailing behind him like a little green ribbon. As he made his way back to his burrow, he passed several animals, each of them stopping to admire his new scarf. "That's a fine scarf you've got there," said Mr. Badger, tipping his hat. "Where did you get it?" asked Mrs. Sparrow, fluttering down from a tree branch. "Milo," said a curious squirrel, "is that one of Winifred's scarves?" Milo beamed. "Yes, it is. She made it just this morning. It's the warmest thing I've ever worn." The animals whispered among themselves, and soon the news spread across the meadow. By the time Winifred had finished tidying up her hollow and sitting down with her tea, there was another knock at her door. This time it was the otters, a pair of playful twins who lived by the river. They grinned up at Winifred, their whiskers twitching with excitement. "Winifred, we heard about Milo's scarf," one of them said. "Could you make us a blanket? It's so cold in the water these days." Before Winifred could answer, more animals began to arrive. A family of mice peeked in, chattering about needing tiny hats for their little ones. An owl landed on her windowsill, asking for a shawl to keep warm during her nighttime flights. Winifred blinked, her paws frozen mid-stitch. "Oh my," she said, looking at the growing crowd, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, she smiled. "Of course, there's plenty of yarn for everyone." The animals cheered, and Winifred got to work, her needles clicking faster than ever. As the sun set over the meadow, Winifred's hollow buzzed with warmth and activity. The fire crackled, the animals sipped tea and nibbled on honey biscuits, and Winifred's knitting basket slowly emptied as she made scarf after scarf, hat after hat, and blanket after blanket. "Don't forget the tassels, Winifred," called one of the otters. "I like pom-poms on my hat," said one of the mice. Winifred chuckled, her paws moving steadily. "Patience, everyone," she said gently. "I'll make sure everything is just right." By the time the moon rose high in the sky, every animal had what they needed to stay warm. The otters wrapped themselves in a soft blue blanket. The mice wore their tiny hats with pride, and the owl swooped off into the night with her shawl trailing behind her. Winifred sat back in her chair, her paws tired but her heart full. She looked at the empty yarn shelves and smiled to herself. "I think I'll need to visit the sheep sooner than I planned," she said softly, sipping her tea. Part 3, News Spreads. The morning after her busy evening of knitting, Winifred sat by her window, enjoying a quiet moment. A soft blanket draped over her lap, and a warm cup of tea rested in her paws. Outside, the meadow was calm. The frost on the grass sparkled in the early sunlight, and the trees stood still, their branches bare from the cold wind. Winifred smiled to herself. She thought about the animals who had visited her hollow the night before, and how cozy they must feel now with their scarves, hats, and blankets. The thought warmed her heart as much as the fire in her heart. Winifred was just about to pick up her knitting needles again when there was a knock at the door. She set down her tea and trotted over, curious to see who it could be so early in the day. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see a large badger standing there. He was wrapped in a thick coat, but his nose was red from the cold. In his paws, he carried a small basket. "Good morning, Miss Winifred," the badger said, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "I've heard about your knitting. The otters told me you made them the warmest blanket they've ever had." Winifred smiled and waved him inside. "Come in, Mr. Badger, you must be freezing." The badger stepped into the hollow, looking around at the warm, colorful space. "It's cozy in here," he said, setting the basket on the table. "I brought you some apples from my tree. I wanted to thank you in advance for your help." Winifred tilted her head. "Help? What do you need, Mr. Badger?" "Well," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "it's going to be a cold winter, and my burrow gets quite drafty. I was hoping you might make me a thick blanket, something warm enough for a badger if it's not too much trouble." Winifred chuckled. "Not too much trouble at all. I'd be happy to help. Thank you for the apples. They'll make a lovely pie." Mr. Badger grinned. "Thank you, Miss Winifred. You're a real treasure." By midday, Winifred was hard at work on Mr. Badger's blanket, using a soft brown yarn that matched his coat. Her needles clicked steadily, filling the hollow with their comforting sound. She was just finishing the first section when there was another knock at the door. This time, it was Mrs. Hedgehog, bundled up in a thick scarf that didn't quite cover her prickly quills. "Winifred," Mrs. Hedgehog said, her voice flustered, "I heard about the scarves you made for the squirrels and the shawl for the owl. Could you possibly make something for me? The wind keeps blowing through my little nest, and it's terribly chilly." "Of course, Mrs. Hedgehog," Winifred said, inviting her inside. "Come sit by the fire while I finish this blanket." Mrs. Hedgehog settled into a chair, sighing with relief as the warmth of the hollow surrounded her. "You're so kind, Winifred," she said. "It's no wonder everyone in the meadow is talking about you." Winifred looked up from her knitting, surprised. "Everyone?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Hedgehog said, nodding. "The mice told the birds, and the birds told the rabbits. Even the deer by the far field have heard about your wonderful knitting." Winifred blushed. She didn't think of herself as anything special. She just liked to help her friends. "Well," she said with a smile, "if anyone needs something cozy, they're always welcome here." Sure enough, as the day went on, more animals began to arrive. A family of chipmunks scurried into the hollow, chattering about needing tiny mittens for their little paws. A fox with a long bushy tail stopped by to ask for a scarf that wouldn't snag on branches. Even the sparrows, who were usually too shy to visit, peeked in to request small blankets for their nests. Winifred worked tirelessly, her needles never stopping. Her paws moved so quickly that the yarn seemed to flow like water, transforming into scarves, hats, and blankets. The animals waited patiently by the fire, sipping tea and nibbling on biscuits as Winifred worked. Despite the growing pile of requests, Winifred never seemed rushed. She listened to each animal's stories, laughing at the chipmunks' jokes and nodding along to the sparrows' songs. Her hollow buzzed with warmth and cheer, and the animals left with smiles on their faces and cozy gifts in their paws. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the meadow in a soft orange glow, Winifred's hollow was quiet again. The animals had all gone home, their laughter and chatter lingering faintly in the air. Winifred sat back in her chair, stretching her tired paws. Her yarn shelves were looking a little bare now, but she didn't mind. The thought of all her friends staying warm through the chilly nights filled her with a deep, peaceful happiness. She poured herself a cup of tea and wrapped a soft blanket around her shoulders. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside the hollow, everything was warm and still. Winifred sighed contentedly, watching the fire crackle. "Tomorrow will be another busy day," she said to herself, smiling, "and I wouldn't have it any other way." Part 4, The Winter Storm. The next morning, Winifred woke up to a strange stillness. She stretched, yawned, and padded over to her window. When she pulled back the curtain, her eyes widened in surprise. The meadow was covered in a thick blanket of white snow. The trees, once bare and brown, now sparkled under the weight of the frost. The sky was gray, and the wind howled through the branches. "Oh dear," Winifred said softly, "winter has come early." She wrapped herself in a cozy shawl and started her day. As she stirred her morning tea, there was a loud gust of wind and her chimney rattled. The storm was picking up. Outside, snowflakes swirled through the air, piling higher and higher. Winifred looked at her yarn shelves and frowned. They were nearly empty after the busy days before. She had just enough left for a few scarves or hats. "I'll need to visit the sheep soon," she thought. But when she peeked outside again, the snow was so deep she could barely see her garden gate. Winifred sat by the fire, sipping her tea and planning how to stretch her yarn, when there was a knock at the door. She hurried over, surprised that anyone would be out in this weather. When she opened the door, she found a young deer standing there. The deer's fur was dusted with snow, and her ears twitched nervously. "Miss Winifred," the deer said, her voice trembling, "there's trouble. Some of the animals are stuck in the forest. The snow came so quickly that they couldn't get back to their homes." Winifred's heart sank. "Stuck in the cold? Oh no, that won't do at all." The deer nodded. "The wind is so strong and it's getting colder. Some of them have no shelter at all." Winifred didn't hesitate. "We'll bring them here," she said firmly. "There's plenty of room, and I'll make sure everyone stays warm. Let's go." Winifred pulled on her coat, wrapped a scarf tightly around her neck, and followed the deer into the snow. The wind bit at her nose, and the snow crunched loudly under her boots. The meadow looked different in the storm. Everything was white and quiet, except for the howling wind. They found the first group of animals huddled under a tree. It was the family of mice, their tiny noses peeking out from under a pile of leaves. "Come with us," Winifred called, holding out her paw. "You can't stay here. It's too cold." The mice scurried over, their little tails dragging behind them. "Thank you, Miss Winifred," squeaked the mother mouse. "We didn't know where to go." Next, they found the chipmunks tucked under a fallen log, shivering and brushing snow off their fur. "Follow me," Winifred said, helping them climb out. "We're going to my hollow. It's warm and safe." One by one, they gathered more animals. A squirrel curled up in a bare tree, a hedgehog struggling to wade through the deep snow, and even the otters, who had ventured too far from their den by the river. By the time they returned to Winifred's hollow, the group was large and shivering. The mice, squirrels, hedgehogs, and otters all squeezed through the door, their fur dusted with snowflakes. Inside the hollow, the animals crowded around the fire, their breath turning to little clouds in the air. Winifred bustled about, hanging their wet coats near the hearth and passing out cups of warm tea. "Don't worry," she said, her voice calm and soothing. "You're safe now. The storm can blow all at once, but we'll stay warm together." The animals smiled gratefully, their shivers slowly fading. Winifred turned to her yarn shelves, her paws working quickly. She grabbed what little yarn she had left and began knitting scarves and hats for the coldest animals. As she worked, the animals began to help. The squirrels gathered firewood from the stack by the door. The otters carried blankets from the cupboard and spread them out on the floor. Even the mice worked together to prepare a big pot of stew using the vegetables and apples from Winifred's pantry. The hollow was soon bustling with activity. The fire crackled brightly, the smell of stew filled the air, and the soft sound of Winifred's knitting needles clicked in the background. As night fell, the storm outside grew even fiercer. The wind howled and snow piled high against the door. But inside the hollow, everything was warm and calm. The animals ate their stew, shared stories, and laughed together. Winifred worked late into the night, knitting until her paws were tired. She made sure every animal had something warm: a scarf for the squirrels, a hat for the hedgehog, and even a small blanket for the chipmunk family. When she finally sat down to rest, she looked around the room. The animals were curled up in cozy corners, wrapped in her scarves and blankets, their bellies full and their eyes drooping with sleep. The hollow was quiet now, except for the soft crackle of the fire and the gentle breathing of her guests. Winifred smiled. "It's a full house," she whispered to herself, "but a warm one." She pulled a blanket over her lap and sipped the last of her tea. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, everything was peaceful. Part 5, A Warm Gathering. By morning, the storm had calmed, but the world outside was still blanketed in snow. The meadow looked like a dream, sparkling in the sunlight. Inside Winifred's hollow, it was warm and cozy. The fire still crackled, and the smell of stew lingered in the air. The animals were waking up slowly, stretching and yawning. The hedgehog rolled over in her blanket, the chipmunks peeked out from under their tiny scarves, and the squirrels rubbed their sleepy eyes. Winifred smiled as she watched them. "Good morning, everyone," she said softly, setting out cups of warm tea. "Did you all sleep well?" The animals nodded, their faces lighting up with gratitude. "I don't think I've ever been this warm in the middle of winter," said the hedgehog, wrapping her blanket tighter. "This stew," said one of the otters, "was the best meal I've had in ages." "And these hats," squeaked one of the mice, adjusting the tiny pom-pom on top of his head. "They're just perfect." Winifred set out a basket of bread and honey for breakfast. The animals gathered around the table, chatting and laughing as they ate. The hollow felt alive with warmth and happiness. "You're amazing, Winifred," said the mother squirrel, nibbling on a piece of bread. "You've made this storm feel like a holiday." Winifred chuckled, her paws busy knitting another scarf. "It's nothing, really. I'm just happy everyone is safe and warm." The sparrows, who had arrived late in the night, began to sing a soft, cheerful tune. Their voices blended beautifully with the crackle of the fire and the soft hum of the animals' chatter. The otters joined in, tapping their tails rhythmically on the wooden floor. Soon, everyone was clapping or swaying along, the hollow filled with music and laughter. When breakfast was over, Winifred stood up and stretched. "Now that the storm has passed," she said, "we should make sure everyone's homes are ready for the cold." The animals nodded eagerly. They were rested, warm, and ready to help. Winifred handed out warm scarves, hats, and blankets to the animals who needed to venture outside. The sparrows helped clear snow from the door, and the otters dug a path through the meadow. Together, they visited each burrow, den, and nest, helping to repair the damage from the storm. The mice patched up their burrow with moss and leaves. The squirrels gathered fresh acorns to store in their hollow tree. Even the hedgehog got a new snug nest lined with soft wool from Winifred's remaining yarn. By the time the sun began to set, the meadow was bustling again. The animals' homes were cozy and warm, and everyone had a scarf, blanket, or hat to keep the cold away. That evening, as the sky turned pink and orange, the animals returned to Winifred's hollow one last time. They carried baskets of gifts: freshly baked acorn pies, jars of honey, and bunches of dried herbs. "These are for you, Winifred," said Mr. Badger, placing a sack of apples on her table. "You've done so much for us. We want to thank you." Winifred looked at the gifts, her heart full. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice soft. "Helping you all is thanks enough." "But you've made this winter special," said the mother mouse. "We're lucky to have you." The animals stayed late into the night, sharing stories and tea by the fire. They laughed, sang, and celebrated the warmth of friendship. Winifred looked around at her crowded, cozy hollow and smiled. It was more than just a place to knit. It was a home. not just for her, but for everyone. When the last of the animals had left, Winifred sat down in her armchair, wrapping herself in a soft shawl. The hollow was quiet again, except for the gentle crackle of the fire. She sipped her tea and gazed out the window, watching the stars twinkle above the snowy meadow. Her heart felt warm, not just from the fire, but from the joy of helping her friends. "It's been a busy few days," she said to herself, her voice soft and content. "But I wouldn't trade it for anything." With that, Winifred picked up her knitting needles and a fresh ball of yarn. She wasn't sure who her next project would be for, but she knew there was always someone who needed a little warmth, and she was happy to provide it.